The events I'm about to share have haunted me for over 30 years. I've tried to suppress the memories, to convince myself they were just figments of an overactive imagination. But deep down, I know better. The truth lingers in the shadows, and it refuses to be ignored. I was around 10 years old, living an otherwise idyllic life in a large, loving family. My father was one of 9 siblings, and my grandparents owned a sprawling beachfront property. It was a place of happiness and chaos, with dozens of cousins, aunts, and uncles filling the house during the summers. Among the adults, my favorite was Uncle Joseph. He had an easy smile, a quick wit, and a way of making me feel heard in a way no one else did. He was also a licensed therapist and psychiatrist, a fact that made his interest in my problems feel reassuring at first. That summer started like any other. Days spent swimming and playing in the sand, nights filled with the comforting hum of family chatter. But soon, my nights became a battlefield. Horrific nightmares plagued me, vivid and unrelenting. They weren't ordinary dreams. These were grotesque visions, family members dying gruesome deaths, endless corridors trapping me in isolation, and a creeping sense of doom I couldn't shake. One dream, in particular, remains seared in my memory. I woke up in my bed, sunlight streaming through the windows. But when I went downstairs, my family was gone. The house was eerily silent. I ran from room to room, calling for my parents, my siblings, anyone. But no one answered. The loneliness was suffocating, and I woke up with my pillow soaked in tears. After enduring a week of these tormenting dreams, I confided in Uncle Joseph. I was too embarrassed to tell my parents, worried they'd think I was being overly dramatic. Uncle Joseph listened intently, scribbling notes in a small leather-bound notebook. His concern felt genuine, as he told me the nightmares were my subconscious trying to tell me something. Dreams, he said, are windows into your inner thoughts, Patrick. Something inside you is struggling to surface. His words made me feel seen, even if I didn't fully understand them. When the nightmares persisted, I returned to him, desperate for a solution. This time, he had an answer. You're repressing resentment toward your parents, he said with certainty. The statement baffled me. I adored my parents. But Uncle Joseph was a therapist. He had to know what he was talking about. He advised me to act out in small ways, say no to chores, question their decisions. He explained that this would help my subconscious release pent-up frustrations. Reluctantly, I followed his advice. For 3 days, I tested boundaries, arguing over trivial things and refusing to do as I was told. My parents were bewildered and hurt, which only deepened my guilt. Worse still, the nightmares didn't stop. They grew more grotesque, faceless figures lurking in corners, shadows clawing at me as I screamed, only to wake drenched in sweat. Frustrated and frightened, I begged Uncle Joseph for another solution. This time, his demeanor shifted. He seemed hesitant, almost uneasy, as he said, "There's one last thing we can try. But it's unconventional." I pleaded with him to tell me. After a long pause, he said, "Your brain is too mature for your young body. It's trying to escape the confines of childhood." I didn't understand, and he refused to elaborate. Instead, he gave me an ominous instruction. "If you have one more nightmare, I'll explain what you need to do." That night, dread kept me awake until sheer exhaustion pulled me under. And for the first time in weeks, I woke up mid-dream. My heart was pounding as I lay there, unable to move. It wasn't sleep paralysis, but a suffocating fear pinned me to the bed. Then I heard it, a whisper right beside my ear. "Patrick," the voice said, low and serpentine. It was Uncle Joseph. I bolted upright, my scream tearing through the silence. Uncle Joseph recoiled, his face half lit by the pale moonlight streaming through the window. For a split second, I saw something in his eyes, something unhuman. He darted out of the room, shutting the door behind him. Trembling, I ran to my parents and spilled everything. I told them about the nightmares, Uncle Joseph's advice, and the disturbing encounter. My father's face darkened with fury. He stormed to Uncle Joseph's room, where a confrontation erupted. Uncle Joseph denied everything, but my father was relentless. In the struggle, he grabbed the satchel Uncle Joseph always carried. Inside were pages upon pages of handwritten notes and printed articles, all detailing methods for inducing nightmares and manipulating dreams. The worst were his personal notes, chilling descriptions of experiments on subjects, including me. One phrase stood out in jagged, frantic handwriting: "Set the soul free to feed the stalker." The police were called, and Uncle Joseph fled before they arrived. The subsequent investigation revealed even darker truths. His computer held files and images that were unspeakable. They painted a picture of a man dabbling in something far beyond psychology, something unnatural. Uncle Joseph was never seen again, but his legacy lingers. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I think I hear that voice again, whispering my name. And in my dreams, I still see the faceless shadows, waiting just beyond the edges of the light. The nightmares never fully disappeared, but as I grew older, I learned to live with them. Therapists offered explanations, ranging from post-traumatic stress to childhood anxiety. Yet none of their reasoning ever felt complete. In my moments of doubt, when the memories claw at the edges of my mind, I wonder if Uncle Joseph was something more than a twisted man. What if he was an agent of something darker, a gateway through which malevolence crept into our world? Years later, I visited the beach house for the last time. My family had sold it off after my grandparents passed, but I couldn't shake the pull to see it again. Standing on the porch, I felt a chill settle over me, and the wind carried a faint, familiar whisper. "Patrick?" I left without looking back, but I knew. The demon stalker wasn't gone. It was waiting, always watching from the shadows. And it still hungers for more. The haunting drive, a near escape in the snowstorm. It was supposed to be a simple drive. A quick visit to my parents' cabin before the snowstorm rolled in, then back to the city the next morning. The forecast had been clear. Snow wouldn't hit until late evening. Yet as I stared through the windshield, snow was already falling in thick, unrelenting waves. The wipers swished back and forth furiously, but it was barely enough to keep up. The road stretched ahead like an endless, featureless void. No streetlights, no other cars. Just the hypnotic dance of snowflakes illuminated by my headlights. Each mile felt longer than the last, the cabin still a good hour away. The deeper I drove into the forest, the more I questioned whether I should turn back. But something about the storm's ferocity made the thought of retracing my steps even worse. The radio was nothing but static now. Cell service had disappeared miles ago. The only sound was the crunch of tires on snow and the occasional groan of wind against the car. It was unnervingly quiet, too quiet. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded, sliding dangerously close to the edge of the embankment. My heart raced as I gripped the wheel, the figure illuminated in my high beams. It was a man, or at least the shape of one, hunched over as if injured. He wore no coat, only a thin shirt and pants, and his skin, what I could see of it, was an unnatural shade of pale. He didn't flinch as the car skidded closer. Instead, he slowly raised his head and looked straight at me. His eyes, they weren't normal. They were dark, deep voids that seemed to swallow the light around them. A shiver ran down my spine as he took a step toward the car. Every instinct screamed at me to drive. Instead, I cracked the window just enough to shout, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" He didn't respond. His lips twitched as if forming words, but no sound came out. The air inside the car grew icy, far colder than it had been a moment ago. My breath fogged up the glass, and a sharp, metallic taste filled my mouth. Panic took over, and I slammed my foot on the accelerator. The car lurched forward, narrowly avoiding the man as he reached out a hand far longer and thinner than it should have been. For miles, I couldn't stop shaking. My grip on the wheel tightened, and I found myself constantly checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing there, staring back at me. But the road remained empty. Or so I thought. I glanced into the mirror again, and my blood turned to ice. He was there, sitting in the back seat. His face was obscured by shadows, but those void-like eyes bore into mine. My scream echoed in the enclosed space as I swerved wildly, the car fishtailing on the icy road. When I turned around, he was gone. The back seat was empty, as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I had seen. "Get a grip," I whispered to myself, my voice trembling. "It's just the storm. You're seeing things." The car's clock read 9:47 p.m., but the numbers flickered as if the power was failing. The headlights dimmed briefly, plunging the road into near-total darkness. I was about to pull over, convinced the car was dying, when they flickered back on. That's when I saw the sign, "Route closed, detour ahead." A wave of dread washed over me. This wasn't supposed to happen. The GPS hadn't mentioned a closure. But with no other options, I followed the detour onto a narrower, less maintained road. The snow was deeper here, the trees pressing in closer on either side. My gut told me to turn around, but I pushed forward. Minutes later, I saw it again, him. Standing on the side of the road this time, watching me pass. There was no mistaking it. He wasn't human. No one could survive out here in a snowstorm, dressed like that, without so much as shivering. The road twisted and turned, the snowbanks growing taller, the sense of isolation heavier. My pulse quickened when I realized the detour wasn't taking me back to the main road. It was leading me deeper into the forest. The clock on the dashboard flickered again, showing random numbers now: 3:21, 7:04, 12 o'clock. The temperature gauge dipped below zero, even though the heater was on full blast. And then the engine sputtered. The car slowed to a crawl before dying completely, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. I sat in silence, the only light coming from the dim glow of the interior dashboard. Snow piled up on the windshield, threatening to bury me alive. I tried the ignition, but it wouldn't even click. Desperation clawed at my chest as I fumbled for my phone, but it was dead, despite being fully charged when I left. A sharp knock on the driver's side window made me jump. I turned slowly, dreading what I might see. There he was, the pale man, his face pressed against the glass. His mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing jagged, blackened teeth. I screamed and locked the doors, though I had no idea if that would do any good. The smile faded, replaced by a look of utter rage. His fists pounded against the glass, each hit echoing like a gunshot in the silent night. Cracks spiderwebbed across the window, and I knew it wouldn't hold much longer. Without thinking, I grabbed the emergency flare from the glove compartment, lit it, and thrust it toward the window. The man recoiled with an inhuman shriek, retreating into the shadows. The flare's red light cast eerie shapes across the snow, but it was the only weapon I had. I burst out of the car, flare in hand, and started running down the road. The snow was relentless, soaking through my clothes as I stumbled forward. The wind carried whispers, low and guttural, like voices calling my name. I glanced over my shoulder and saw him again, this time crawling toward me on all fours, his limbs bending in unnatural angles. The flare's light kept him at bay, but it was burning down quickly. Up ahead, a faint glow broke through the trees. A cabin. My parents' cabin. With every ounce of strength, I sprinted toward it, my lungs burning and legs trembling. As I reached the porch, the flare finally sputtered out. I threw myself against the door, pounding and shouting for help. The door opened, and I collapsed inside. My parents stood there, faces pale with worry as they pulled me to safety. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come out. My father grabbed a rifle, while my mother bolted the door and drew the curtains. Outside, the wind howled, but nothing came. We waited in tense silence until dawn, when the storm finally broke. When we ventured outside, there were no footprints in the snow other than mine. To this day, I'm not sure what I encountered on that road. A ghost, a demon, something else entirely? All I know is that I was never meant to survive that drive. And whenever a snowstorm hits, I still feel those eyes watching from the shadows, waiting for me to slip up and take the wrong road again. The series of events I'm about to recount. The story I'm about to share unfolded over 30 years ago, in the cold shadow of my early childhood. It's the kind of memory I've spent decades trying to forget, only for it to claw its way back to the surface when I least expect it. For years, I told myself it was just a bad dream or a cruel trick of a child's imagination. But no amount of denial can erase what I know in my bones to be true. I was around 10 years old at the time. My father came from a massive family, one of 9 siblings. Every summer, my grandparents' grand beachfront property became a bustling haven for the extended family. Aunts, uncles, and cousins, too many for me to keep track of, congregated under one roof. It was loud, chaotic, and brimming with love. Amid the crowd of relatives, one figure stood out: Uncle Joseph. Uncle Joseph was a charmer. His laughter was infectious, his wit quick, and his presence magnetic. As a licensed therapist and psychiatrist, he had a knack for reading people, a quality that fascinated me. To a child like me, he seemed endlessly wise. But as it turns out, wisdom can mask a darkness too deep to comprehend. It began with nightmares. That summer, sleep became a torment. Each night, I'd tumble into vivid, grotesque dreams that left me waking in terror. In one, I wandered alone through endless hallways, the walls pulsing with an unnatural, organic life. In another, faceless figures dragged my parents into a black abyss while I stood frozen, screaming silently. The worst dream, the one I can never forget, was eerily quiet. I woke in my room, everything seemingly normal, but when I ventured downstairs, the house was empty. The silence pressed down on me, suffocating, until I collapsed in tears on the floor. After a week of this torment, I turned to Uncle Joseph. I didn't want to worry my parents, and besides, Uncle Joseph always knew what to say. I found him sitting on the porch one evening, his ever-present notebook in hand. He listened intently as I described my nightmares, his pen scratching rapidly across the pages. "Dreams," he said, "are the subconscious screaming to be heard. Something inside you is desperate to escape." I didn't know what he meant, but his words gave me a sliver of hope. When the nightmares persisted, I went to him again, more desperate than before. This time, his solution unsettled me. "You're harboring resentment toward your parents," he said matter-of-factly. The accusation stung. I loved my parents. But Uncle Joseph assured me it was normal. Dreams, he explained, often reveal feelings we're too afraid to admit to ourselves. He suggested a simple experiment: be slightly rebellious. Question them, say no more often. He said this would ease the tension brewing in my subconscious. At first, I was hesitant, but the nightmares showed no mercy, so I gave in. For 3 days, I acted out, something entirely out of character for me. I argued over small things, defied bedtime, even refused to help set the dinner table. My parents were hurt, confused, and concerned, and I was drowning in guilt. To my dismay, the nightmares only grew more horrifying. When I confessed this to Uncle Joseph, his demeanor shifted. His jovial warmth faded, replaced by a quiet intensity. "There is one last method," he murmured, almost as if to himself. I begged him to tell me, and after a pause, he leaned in close, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Your mind has outgrown your body. It's time to set it free." The words sent a chill through me, though I didn't understand their meaning. I pressed him for details, but he wouldn't say more. "If you have another nightmare," he finally said, "I'll show you what to do." That night, fear kept me awake long past midnight. When I finally succumbed to exhaustion, my slumber was restless and shallow. At some point, I became half aware of my surroundings, trapped in that liminal space between dreaming and waking. That's when I heard it. A whisper, low and insidious, so close it tickled my ear. "Wake up, Patrick." The voice was unmistakable. Uncle Joseph. I shot up in bed, my scream dying in my throat as my eyes adjusted to the dim moonlight. There, at the foot of my bed, stood Uncle Joseph. His face was obscured by shadow, but his outline was unmistakable. For a moment, he remained still, watching me. Then, with an unnervingly smooth movement, he stepped backward, retreating into the darkness of the hallway. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. Shaking, I bolted out of bed and ran to my parents' room. Between sobs, I spilled everything: the nightmares, Uncle Joseph's help, and what I had just witnessed. My father's face hardened with a rage I'd never seen before. Without a word, he stormed to Uncle Joseph's room. The confrontation that followed was explosive. My father demanded answers, while Uncle Joseph deflected, insisting I was confused. In the heat of the argument, my father grabbed Uncle Joseph's satchel, the one he always carried. What spilled out made my stomach churn. There were notebooks filled with handwritten notes detailing dream experiments, lists of triggers, and macabre theories about releasing the mind from its vessel. More alarming were the diagrams and rituals, scribbled in an almost manic hand. One phrase stood out, scrawled across multiple pages: "Set the soul free to feed the stalker." The police were called, but Uncle Joseph fled before they arrived. During their investigation, more horrors came to light. His personal computer contained files documenting experiments on other children, videos, photos, logs of induced nightmares. And there were references to something ancient. A presence, a being that fed on fear, drawn to vulnerable minds. The authorities never caught him. Uncle Joseph vanished, leaving behind only questions and an endless shadow over my childhood. For years, I tried to move on, to tell myself it was over. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I'll wake up to the faintest whisper, "Patrick," and in my dreams, I still see the shadows. Waiting, watching, whispering just beyond the veil of consciousness, biding their time until they can feast again.